Ignorance on side government. That's the only thing we can see here. And this ignorance, we're going to explain three things. Firstly, they do not recognize the benefits or the practical implications that have already happened. They say that the G20, the G20 summit cannot have any practical implication because apparently it's ineffective, because it's so short, and because it doesn't have a set rule of procedures. Well, if that were true, and we've rebutted to each of these subpoints in our first speech, but even if we give them those points, if that were to stand, they needed to show that there have been no practical implications at all. That's the burden, under their definition, that they set upon themselves today. But here I give you the example of the Washington Declaration. What is the Washington Declaration? In the Washington Declaration that was established in the first G20 summit, what happened was the discussion and the improved communication between these G20 countries, and they were able to clarify the root cause of the economic problem that they were facing, of the economic crisis that we were facing back in 2008.
1 point, ma'am.
No, thank you, sir. And with the identification of this root cause, what they were able to do is to set a basis for development, for these practical implications to come into space. Now, since they have not rebutted to our point about how the standards set by the G20 are actually passed on to bodies that do have the binding power to enact such policies, we believe that the practical implications stand. Firstly, because of the very characteristic of the G20, which provides a basic guideline, which then passes on these guidelines to bodies that have the binding power to enact these policies, therefore ending in their so-called goal of practical implications.
One question, ma'am.
No, thank you, sir. Now let's move on to some other petty rebuttals. They said that the communication doesn't foster any kind of practical implication, and the only example they mentioned was the currency war. The Seoul summit, according to them, was something that was supposed to solve this currency war that's waging right now. Well, let me give you that. Let me revert to that point by saying that they actually did reach a conclusion on the point about the currency war by saying that we need more time to look at the situation, to assess the situation, to get more information about the situation. So what the leaders did, no thank you sir, was to set an agenda for the next year. So set an agenda for 2011 and say that we are going to solve that issue then. Because we recognize the need for more information, for a more thorough assessment of the situation, of the currency war that we face today. Because they do not want a rash implication that would not work. No, thank you sir. Now, another problem they mentioned with the G20 was the lack of expertise. Well, we give you another point where they have exemplified their ignorance for all of you to see. We see the very existence of Sherpas, who are negotiation experts that exist in the G20 system. The G20 summit is not only comprised of the heads of state, as they claim, as their ignorance claims. It's actually composed of these Sherpas and the leaders of other binding powers that they want to serve, such as WTO or the IMF. The representatives who have this expertise, according to their definition, no thank you sir, do take part in the G20 summit. And what we say is that the increased communication between these leaders who represent the entities that have the binding power and the G20 heads of states, this is what provides the basis for practical implication. This is what directly leads to practical implication, to practical solutions to problems in today's world. No, thank you, sir. Now, they said that this was a whimsical stance, that Frenchman just said 20 nations. Well, we don't see a problem with that when it actually has results. And as we've shown you that this has played a key role in solving the 2008 financial crisis, we don't see how that is such a bad thing when we see practical results, practical implications that have happened, that will happen directly from this G20 nations. They also mentioned that developing nations weren't getting enough of a stance in the G20. We see that's not a fact. As we see the leaders from the African Union taking part, as we see various leaders from these developing nations are being invited to take part, and that increased communication between developing nations and developed nations are actually what fosters the communication and provides, once again, a basis for practical implication that leads to practical solutions. We see that this case is, no thank you sir, simply does not stand on the side of the government. Now, without further ado, let me move on into our third argument, how it promotes exchange in the private sector. In our first two arguments, we told you that it promotes discussion in the public sector, how it promotes a discussion between citizens and the government, and how the leaders of the governments are able to communicate with each other on a more familiar level. In this argument, we're going to tell you about how it promotes exchange in private sectors between businesses. Now, why is this exchange so important? Because once again, we say that G20 is an arena for discussion and dialogue, not only for the heads of state who represent the governments, but the entities from the private sectors that do also participate. The G20 summit is not only a place, an arena of discussion for these heads of state, they're actually an arena of discussion for these private sectors as well, because they include a business summit. And what does this business summit do? This business summit opens the door for businessmen to directly present their case, firstly to the heads of states. So it increases communication between the private sector and the public sector. So they can solve the discrepancies within the policies, so they can cooperate in order for a better practical solution. Yes, sir.
So can you tell me one real-life change that happened as a result of this year's G20 summit?
One real-life change, as I keep mentioning again and again, is a solution to the 2008 financial crisis. If it were not for this G20 and clarifying the root cause of the 2008 financial crisis, no practical implication, no practical solution to solve that crisis would have happened. But without interruption, let me move on into the second point about this argument. The second point about this argument is that it actually increases communication between these businesses, not only between the business and the public sector, but between these private sector businesses as well. It actually manifests these communications, as we can see from the Seoul Business Summit. 120 CEOs from 34 countries gathered here, and 66 resolutions confirmed that had been presented in the previous 4 months, and we were able to reach conclusions to 66 important resolutions, including free trade, increase in investments abroad, and so on. But more importantly, interaction between companies, one-to-one interaction between one-to-one business meetings were able to culminate in discussions on know-how, contributing to the overall growth of the industry as a whole. So we on side opposition have told you about how it facilitates international cooperation, how it sets the basis for that, secondly, how it gives press attention, and lastly, how it promotes interaction between the private sector as well. So that discussion is necessary for the basis. And this is why we oppose. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 7 minutes.